We tend to believe that civilizations die with a scream and a bang, but usually they die with a whisper. They die not when the walls are breached by the enemy, but when the money in your pocket is no longer worth the metal it is stamped on. This is Tom from the Collapse Log, exploring the rise and fall of empires. Because behind every golden age lies a quiet decay no one sees until it is too late. If you traveled back in time 2,000 years to the height of the Roman Empire, you would find something remarkable. You would find a currency called the denarius. It was a small silver coin about the size of a dime, and it was the dollar of the ancient world. You could spend it in Syria, you could spend it in Spain, you could spend it in Britain. It was accepted everywhere because it was real. Under the first emperor Augustus, the denarius was 98% pure silver. It was honest money. A soldier serving in the legions knew that his pay had intrinsic value. A baker selling bread knew that the coin he received could be saved for 10 years, and it would still buy the same amount of flour. This stability was the bedrock of the Pax Romana. It was the foundation of the greatest economy the world had ever seen. But Rome fell. And we are taught in school that it fell because of barbarian invasions. We are told about the Goths and the Vandals and the Huns. We are told about weak emperors and political corruption. But those were just the symptoms. The disease was in the money itself. The fall of Rome is actually a story about a 200-year-long scam perpetrated by the government against its own people. It is a story of how the emperors slowly stole the wealth of the world by replacing silver with copper and telling the people it was the same thing. It is the story of the silver lie. To understand how this happened, we have to look at the temptation of power. Being an emperor is expensive. You have to build aqueducts and temples to keep the people happy. You have to pay the Praetorian Guard to keep you safe. And most importantly, you have to pay the legions on the frontier to keep the barbarians out. For a long time, Rome paid for this by conquering new lands. When they took over a country, they looted its gold and silver mines. The treasury remained full. But eventually, the expansion stopped. The empire reached its natural limits. There were no more rich kingdoms to plunder. But the bills kept coming. The soldiers still needed to be paid. The crisis began in the year 64 AD with the Emperor Nero. Nero is famous for fiddling while Rome burned, but his real crime was economic. After the Great Fire of Rome, Nero needed massive amounts of money to rebuild the city and to build his own golden palace. He did not want to raise taxes because that would make him unpopular. So he had an idea that would doom the empire centuries later. He ordered the mint to collect the silver coins. He melted them down, and then he added a little bit of base metal, a little bit of copper. He lowered the silver purity from 98% to 93%. To the naked eye, the new coin looked exactly the same. It shined like silver. It had the face of the emperor. It had the official stamp of Rome. But it was a lie. By reducing the purity, Nero could mint more coins with the same amount of silver. He had created free money. It seemed like magic. He paid his contractors. He paid the army. And nobody noticed. But Nero had opened Pandora's box. He taught every future emperor that if they ran out of money, they didn't need to balance the budget. They just needed to debase the currency. After Nero, the slide was slow at first. It was 1% here and 1% there. But then came the 2nd century, and the cost of maintaining the empire exploded. The barbarians were getting stronger. The border wars were getting more expensive. The Emperor Septimius Severus took power in the year 193. He was a military dictator. His final advice to his sons was chilling in its simplicity. He said, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men. Enrich the soldiers." That was the only rule that mattered. The army was the only thing keeping the emperor alive. If the soldiers were happy, the emperor stayed on the throne. If the soldiers were unhappy, the emperor was assassinated. Severus raised the pay of the army by 50%, but the treasury didn't have 50% more silver, so he debased the denarius again. He dropped the purity down to about 50%. Now the decline was visible. The coins didn't shine quite as bright. They looked a little dull. Merchants started to notice. And this is where the economic laws kicked in. There is a law in economics called Gresham's law. It says that bad money drives out good money. When the people realized that the new coins were 50% junk, they stopped spending the old coins. They hoarded the old Augustus coins, which were pure silver, and they buried them in the garden. They only spent the new junk coins. This meant the velocity of real wealth slowed down, but more importantly, it caused inflation. If a merchant knows that the coin you are giving him is half copper, he is going to demand 2 coins instead of 1 to sell you a bag of wheat. Prices in Rome began to rise, and when prices rose, the soldiers complained. They said our pay isn't enough to buy food for our families. We need a raise. So the emperor had to give them another raise, and to pay for that raise, he had to debase the currency even more. It became a death spiral, a feedback loop of inflation and debasement. By the mid-3rd century, the situation had become a catastrophe. This period is known as the crisis of the 3rd century. Rome nearly collapsed 50 years before the actual date we usually cite. The emperors of this time were desperate. They introduced a new coin called the Antoninianus. It was supposed to be worth 2 denarii. It was a large, impressive-looking coin, with the emperor wearing a radiant crown. But it was a fraud. It was basically a slug of bronze, washed in a very thin layer of silver. When these coins came fresh from the mint, they looked silver. But after a few weeks of being handled in the market, the thin silver wash would rub off. The nose of the emperor would turn brown. The edges would turn red. The lie was exposed for everyone to see. The money of Rome was literally rusting in people's pockets. The silver content dropped to 5%, then 2%, then almost 0. Imagine the psychological impact of this. For centuries, the image of the emperor on a coin meant stability. It meant trust. Now the image of the emperor was rubbing off to reveal cheap copper underneath. The state had broken its contract with the people. The economy disintegrated. Inflation went vertical. Prices didn't just double, they went up by 1,000%. The banking system collapsed because nobody wanted to lend money if they were going to be paid back in worthless scrap metal. Trade networks broke down. A merchant in Egypt used to sell grain to Rome in exchange for coins. Now he refused the coins. He demanded payment in goods. He wanted gold, or he wanted actual commodities. The complex international economy of the empire reverted to a primitive barter system. But the most dangerous consequence was in the army. Remember the rule, enrich the soldiers. Well, you couldn't enrich them anymore. You were paying them in trash. The soldiers realized that they were fighting and dying for copper washers that couldn't buy a pair of boots. So they started to pay themselves. The legions turned into bandit gangs. If the emperor couldn't pay them, they would sack a Roman city. They would loot the provinces they were supposed to be protecting. The protectors became the predators. General after general declared himself emperor, hoping to seize the mint and pay his troops. In a span of 50 years, Rome had 26 different emperors. Most of them were murdered by their own troops when the money ran out. The chaos was absolute. The barbarians saw this weakness. They saw that the Roman army was demoralized and ill-equipped. They saw that the walls were unguarded because the sentries hadn't been paid, and they attacked. The empire split into 3 pieces. It looked like the end. But then, a strong emperor named Diocletian took power in the year 284. He was a tough, pragmatic soldier, and he tried to stop the bleeding. Diocletian understood that the inflation was destroying the state. But he made a critical mistake. He thought he could stop inflation by passing a law. He issued the famous edict on maximum prices. It was a massive list of every good and service in the empire. It listed the maximum price for wheat, for wine, for olive oil, for boots, for the wages of a stone mason, for the wages of a scribe. And the punishment for violating this edict was death. If you sold a loaf of bread for more than the emperor said, you were executed. If you bought it for more than the emperor said, you were executed. It was the ultimate attempt at government control over the economy, and it failed completely. Even the threat of death could not change the laws of supply and demand. If a baker could not sell his bread for a profit, because of the price cap, he simply stopped baking bread. The shops closed. The goods disappeared from the markets. People traded on the black market in back alleys. The economy was paralyzed. Diocletian eventually had to repeal the law because the streets were empty and the people were starving. He also tried to reform the currency. But the trust was gone. The people knew that the government would eventually debase the new coins too. It wasn't until the Emperor Constantine took over that a semblance of stability returned, but it came at a terrible cost. Constantine introduced a new gold coin called the solidus. It was pure gold, and it was stable. But there was a catch. The gold coin was only for the rich. It was used by the government, the generals, and the wealthy aristocrats. The common people, the peasants and the shopkeepers were left with the worthless copper bags of dust. Constantine created a two-tier economy, a gold economy for the elite and a collapsing copper economy for the masses. The middle class was wiped out. The independent farmers became serfs tied to the land because they couldn't afford to pay their debts. The society of Rome became rigid and brittle. The patriotism that had fueled the early legions was dead. Why would a man fight for an empire that stole his savings and crushed his freedom? When the final waves of barbarian invasions came in the 5th century, the Roman people simply didn't care enough to stop them. In some cases, they welcomed the barbarians. The Goths might have been rough, but they didn't have a tax collector who demanded gold and gave back copper. Rome didn't fall in a day. It was hollowed out from the inside for 200 years. The silver lie was the termite that ate the foundation of the house. By the time the Visigoths kicked in the door, the house was already standing on air. We look at the coins in museums today. We see the silver denarius of Augustus, and it looks noble. We see the copper Antoninianus of the late empire, and it looks pathetic. It looks cheap. It feels light. That physical change in the metal tells the whole history of the collapse. It tells the story of leaders who chose the easy way out. Leaders who chose to print their way out of debt rather than make hard decisions. Leaders who believed they could trick the market and trick the people forever. The parallels to our modern world are uncomfortable. We no longer use silver or gold. We use paper and digital digits. But the mechanism is the same. When a government spends more than it earns, it has to make up the difference. In ancient Rome, they melted the coins and added copper. In the modern world, the central bank clicks a mouse and adds zeros to the balance sheet. They call it quantitative easing. They call it liquidity injection. Nero called it adjusting the weights. The vocabulary changes, but the logic is identical. It is a transfer of wealth from the saver to the spender. It is a hidden tax on everyone who holds the currency. Every time the money supply is expanded without an increase in real value, the money in your pocket dies a little bit. It buys a little less bread. It buys a little less fuel. It feels like the price of things is going up, but in reality, the value of your money is going down. The Roman citizen in the 3rd century didn't understand why life was getting so hard. He didn't understand global economics. He just knew that he worked harder every year, but he could afford less every year. He blamed the merchant. He blamed the foreigner. He blamed the gods. But the thief was the face on the coin. Rome teaches us that money is not just a tool of commerce. It is a form of communication. It transmits value across time and space. When you debase the currency, you scramble the signal. You introduce static into the line. When the signal gets too noisy, people stop listening. They stop investing in the future. They stop building businesses. They retreat into survival mode. And a civilization in survival mode is a civilization that is already dead. The barbarians at the gate are not the cause of the collapse. They are the cleanup crew. They arrive only when the spirit of the empire has already been broken by the slow, grinding theft of inflation. The silver lie is the oldest trick in the book. It promises something for nothing. It promises that we can have wars and palaces and bread and circuses without paying for them. But history keeps the ledger, and the ledger shows that the bill always comes due. Rome paid the bill with its existence. The question for every great power that follows in Rome's footsteps is simple. When the metal is gone and only the lie remains, what will be left to defend?